Here is my LEGO Technic Ford Bronco Sport model. The idea with this build was to combine a few interesting features, which are a torque vectoring central differential, a twin clutch rear axle, which disconnects the inside wheel when cornering, and more advanced suspension geometry. On top of this, there's other more traditional but still complicated functions like drive, steering, an 8-speed sequential gearbox, and disc brakes. Here's what it looks like. There's a fairly complete interior with driver's seats that can tilt and a 60/40 folding rear bench. The center console can open up. There's some storage inside. And we've got just the dashboard. There's even some brown bricks back there, which is interesting for me. Then a working steering wheel there. There should be another air vent there, but it must have broken off. There are a number of opening elements on the car. The hood can open and be supported by this stock. The doors all open. And the tailgate can open. The suspension in this model is relatively complicated. In the front there's an independent McPherson strut design, and in the rear an independent multi-link design. Both of these are derived from the real suspension on the vehicle, with links in approximately the same positions. Well, actually it was a previous generation Ford Escape I looked at, but I was assuming the geometry would be similar, because they're based on a lot of the same engineering. Here you can see the McPherson strut front suspension. So we've got the lower wishbone here. And then up on the top we've just got this shock that rotates with the steering. So it works pretty well. I was happy with the setup. Then this link here is for the steering. The rear suspension is considerably more complicated in an effort to replicate the real vehicle suspension, and largely as a result it's also less functional because the way I modeled all the links and everything didn't allow me to put the shock absorber in the best spot, which allowed some bending and some compromises. I don't really think complicated suspension geometry is the best in LEGO, but it is still interesting to do. And then it ended up being too soft, so I ended up having to add some rubber bands. So anyways, we've got a longitudinal link here. We've got a wishbone here. We've got a link here. And what else? Up above the shock absorber, right in the center there, we have another 6L link. And I think that may be all. And the shock absorber is in a realistic enough spot, right there, on the wishbone. Steering is done with the Power Functions medium motor, and is a fairly simple system. It just steers the front wheels, and also the steering wheel. Well, actually maybe I shouldn't have called it a fairly simple system. It is actually reasonably complicated. We've got the M motor going to a worm gear, which then comes down here, runs this 24-tooth gear through an 8-tooth gear, which then moves the rack for the actual steering. And then it runs all these 16-tooth gears over here, which runs the chain, which runs the steering wheel. But from this gear, we also run to these gears, which then flip this switch when steering happens to the two extreme positions. This switch is connected to this servo motor here, so that when the steering goes off-center, like it is right now, it disconnects the inside rear. So right now in that position, this wheel can spin freely, while the other one oversteers on the outside. A similar system is used in some trims of the new Ford Bronco Sport, where it has one clutch in each half shaft. Mine are actually up here, and well, theirs is presumably more complicated and probably doesn't completely disconnect the wheel. This is a reasonably good demonstration of it in Technic. So this servo motor here, this is what it looks like, what it does when the steering goes. So back to center, and then to the other side. So this 22 gear runs a 12-tooth gear right above it, which then rotates that orange rotary catch there, which there are 3L driving rings right below and above it, which are connected to the two half shafts for the motor. Although, as I said, the real car does have this half-shaft-based system, it also includes a locking feature for use off-road that essentially has the effect of a normal locking differential. So that's done with this medium motor here, which simply flips this switch. So right now it is off, right now it is on, or the axle disconnect is on, or off. So I'm going to steer, so that switch is moved. And now, normally this servo would have rotated to disconnect a wheel, but because this is in the center, it hasn't. But if I adjust this and turn on the axle disconnect, like that, the servo immediately moves. Another advanced feature that I tried to model here was a torque vectoring central differential. A lot of modern all-wheel drive systems in real life use this, and essentially it allows them to vary the amount of torque sent to the front and rear wheels. Often the default will be, say, 70% of the torque to the front wheels and 30% to the rear wheels, or maybe even more to the front. But then, depending on conditions or drive mode, it may be changed quite a bit, perhaps to 50% front and 50% rear. I believe the way this system works is by more or less changing the gear ratios on the two sides of the central differential. So if the gear ratio is lower in the back, then the rear will have more torque. However, they'll actually be moving at the same speed because the central differential will operate to compensate for that, but the torque difference will still be there. So the way mine works, I have this medium motor here, which runs this antique 20 times planetary reduction block, which I think is a really neat part. I think people should use it more often. But anyways, it then runs these gears, which run these two wave selectors. So this is how it works. The clutch is done inside this part, by the way. So in this position here, this driving ring actually doesn't engage anything, but you can see there the black half beam right above it, which meshes with a dark gray driving ring, and that gear is actually the functioning one. So right here, this side of the differential goes 12 to a blue 22 gear above that, so it's a reduction. And up here, it goes from this blue 22 gear to a 12-tooth gear above it. So it's speeding up in the back and slowing down in the front. This is considerably front biased. There's more torque in the front. It's largely a front-wheel drive vehicle in this mode. But then if I flip it back the other way, this engages this 16-tooth gear with a red 16-tooth above it, and this 16 with another one above it. So at that point, the two ratios from there are exactly the same. In the end, it doesn't actually equate to a 50% torque split, because there's also differential gearing in the front and other gearing in the back, but it's relatively close. Although the system was rather complicated, I really don't expect it would have much of a difference in practice, especially because the vehicle simply isn't designed for performance. It doesn't really have the power to do anything that would require a certain torque bias, but it's still very interesting for me to implement it. I'm not sure if any such system has ever been done before in Technic, so I was glad to include it. Also, it's probably good to note that the difference between the two modes is exactly the same. Basically, this means that I'm not actually changing gears. The vehicle will always move at the same speed. It'll just, the one mode, it'll have more torque in the rear. There are disc brakes on all four wheels. I have there's a Power Functions medium motor up there, behind this 16-tooth gear, which then runs this one, which then runs these bevel gears you can see here, just a little bit of tan. Then it runs a shaft going that way, which you can see down here, which then moves those light bluish-gray half beams, as you can see there, which then pulls a linkage. Actually, it's the 5L beam with the ball joint at the end, which then, in the end, will pull this rubber part against the brake disc. So, if I turn the brake on, it's fairly stiff to turn, but if I release it, I can wiggle it like that. Rather than include a long drive shaft from the front to the rear, which would have been challenging to package and also would have added a lot of backlash between the braking systems, this time I chose to add a separate medium motor in the rear for braking. So you can see it's tucked right there, and using a fairly similar system to in the front, it operates the rear brake. So when it's off, you can see I can wiggle that fairly easily, but if I turn on the brake, it's now stiff and looser. The drivetrain of the model is also fairly complex, and just like the real vehicle, I made it a major goal of mine to have the drive motors, piston engine, and gearbox all oriented transversely, so sideways, to be true to the real vehicle. In fact, that's one of the reasons I chose to build this in the first place, because I wanted to try building a modern crossover SUV with the transverse drivetrain and advanced suspension. So I'm going to be showing you the gearbox in a minute, but first I'm going to have to remove the inline 4-piston engine just to let you get a better look at it. So the gearbox I've used is a 8-speed design that I've used quite a few times before. It's probably my favorite gearbox for use right now because it has a lot of speeds in a small, reliable package. In my opinion, it's probably the smallest 8-speed sequential gearbox I've seen that has the strengths needed for use in a real model. So you can't actually see all of it. A fair bit of it is under this servo motor. If I take off the grill, you can see a bit more. So that wave selector there shifts between, well, it's a little 2-speed gearbox with a slight difference between gears. Then up here, you can see a little bit of the 4-speed gearbox that is multiplied by the 2-speed. So it's shifted by this servo motor here using a sort of one-touch type of mechanism. By this I mean that it's maybe a paddle shift mechanism, you might call it, where for one push of the remote lever it shifts forward a gear, and then releasing it brings it back to center. So there's an upshift, or a downshift, another downshift, another downshift, and so on. Drive is done with these two Power Functions large motors, and also runs this inline 4-piston engine. Here is the model driving in first gear. It's certainly not fast, but it does move, unlike some of my cars I've made. Second gear. Third gear. Fourth gear. Fifth gear. Yeah, fifth gear doesn't work. I'm not convinced sixth does either, but we'll see. Sixth gear. Based on the sound of the motors, it seems like it's probably about a neutral gear, actually. Seventh gear seems to be just stalling the motor. And so does eighth gear. Overall, I think I am pleased with this model. I know it isn't that great looking, and it doesn't function such that you'd actually want to drive it. It's not very reliable or anything, but it did meet a lot of my goals, such as including sophisticated suspension, the torque vectoring central differential, and the twin clutch rear axle. Also was happy I could have the longitudinal, the transverse drivetrain, and be able to fit in the gearbox and brakes and everything. So I'm pleased with the functionality of this model, like basically the amount of things I was able to fit into it, the interesting parts, but not so much with the way it looked or functioned in real life. But that's how I'm okay with most of my models being, because I build it for the enjoyment of building, for engineering interesting solutions, not actually for having a finished product.